this week and saw a bald eagle, American kestrel, and several brown-headed cowbirds. Ooh, Nancy West in her backyard in downtown Bradenton saw a black-throated green warbler.
Very cool.
Then Asher, Sarasota, large flocks of white pelicans. Oh, aren't they fun? And black skimmers in Upper Lake at Mayaca.
I saw those white pelicans too. They're out here on Palmer.
They have good taste. Juncos.
Yeah, I'm getting dark-eyed juncos. We only get them when it's cold up high. We're only at 3,000 feet, so they come down to us when it's
Chilly up there, huh?
Yeah.
Sophie, what are you seeing in Montana?
Well, quite a few rough-legged hawks. That's the time of year that we get them in the winter, which is really nice. So
Rough-legged
that's
hawks?
the big
That would be a lifer.
They are just beautiful, and I often sit at my desk and can see them flying over my field. So, and then some northern harriers, which has been nice, but
We have those.
We do have those, yeah.
I bet.
all right. Well, why don't we get started with I'll move on to the next slide and I'll let
Somebody saw a gopher tortoise. It's a gopher tortoise laying eggs in our backyard at Lakewood Ranch. Oh, really? I'm in Lakewood Ranch. Where are you?
Really cool though.
Yeah.
Country Club.
Yes.
All right. Okay, Sarah, take it
You want me
away.
to take it?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you on here. It has been a busy month. We've got lots and lots going on. To start, we have the patio sale coming up this weekend. We have lots of items in the patio sale this year, lots of books, tons of bird feeders. So come on out the 18th and the 19th. If you would like to volunteer, I know Andy could definitely use a few more volunteers. That would be great. Just contact Andy at the Nature Center or reach out by calling the Nature Center and they can get you hooked up with a volunteer time slot. But yeah, there's way more than they've had in years past. So it'll be really fun to sift through and find some good finds in there. The next thing we have going on tomorrow, we have, or not tomorrow, tomorrow's Tuesday. Wednesday. The 15th. We have Sean Carey coming to the Nature Center. Going to do a talk with us for our members. This is a great member benefit. So please come on out and it'll be nice to see everyone. We got some good food. He'll give a great talk and we'll all get together and be together.
And you don't need to register.
No, and I forgot it's 2 o'clock?
Yes, 2 to 3:30.
Yes, 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So yeah, just show up. This is a big deal coming up. We're rolling out a new member platform that will allow us to give the members more benefits. So that's why there's a little delay in having you guys renew your memberships, because we are going to a cloud-based system where you will be able to get a 10% discount in the gift shops. You'll be able to register for events early as a member. And we are going to try and increase the member-only events that we have and communicate that through this membership platform. So there'll be a lot more member benefits coming up. It'll probably be about 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, you'll receive an email from the Member Planet system asking you to register. Please do that. It'll allow you to renew your membership. And then everyone will be in a big member database that we'll be able to use to give you your member benefits. It's also where we're going to be converting our email system. So all emails will start coming through there. So it's really, really important that you register through that system and look out for that email. I'll make sure that we're sending lots of communication so that if you miss the email, you can get it again, and I'll send invites for anybody who doesn't join right away. So I'll make sure everybody gets an opportunity to do that, but please don't throw that one in your recycle bin, register and get your membership up to date. It is coming. The other really big thing that's coming out is the Smith Farm. So we won at the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission recommended that they not rezone the Smith Farm, but they're recommending to the Board of County Commissioners that they not rezone the Smith Farm. So the County Commission meeting is on February 12th, and we need everyone. It's going to be an all-out email assault. To the County Commission. We want everyone emailing, and we need the turnout at the meeting to be much bigger. So mark your calendar, February 12th. We are not going to
9 a.m. in the morning, right? Starting 9 a.m.
It starts at 9 a.m. I don't know where
Downtown,
we're gonna,
not at Venice, downtown.
not sure on that. They've
Oh,
said
okay.
downtown, but the building's still not in use, so I'm not
Oh.
sure. I will give everyone updates. There'll be a lot more communication to come on this, and we're going to have you guys wait on the emails maybe a week or two, because we want them to get past their other county commissioner meetings. So it's really the thing that they're focused on when we're sending the emails, and we can really be most effective with the emails. So please look for those emails towards the 1st of February, and we're going to hit them hard at that point. Just have all of your talking points ready, and anybody that can show up and just speak, just even a sentence or two about why Celery Fields is a special place to you, and how this farm will turning this farm into 126 homes will adversely affect your experience there. I would really appreciate the support on that.
But Sarah, even if they don't want to speak, they should come.
Yes, just come in. If you don't want to speak, please just sit in the audience and just show that the support is there. That would be very, very important. Absolutely. With that, I'm going to hand it off so we can get on with Miss Sophie.
Whoops.
Oh, there was a question. Somebody asked, will the member information be kept confidential?
Yes. Yeah, it's only visible by the admins, which is just a few
Couple
of the
of
board
us,
members.
not even the whole board. So
No.
yeah. Okay. All right. So I forgot to give the housekeeping Q&A. Please put your answers or questions for the speaker in Q&A. If you have logistical questions, you can put them in the chat. I will be monitoring both, and we will we'll have time for questions at the end.
Yes.
All right, take it away, Margie.
Okie dokie. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sophie Osborn, who's just come out with a wonderful new book called Feather Trails, and she'll tell you more about it, and so will I. I really encourage you to buy this book. It's just a wonderful read, and it's getting great reviews. So Sophie is an award-winning environmental author and wildlife biologist whose work has included the study and conservation of over a dozen bird species in the Americas. And she's speaking to us tonight from her home. South of Missoula, Montana, in 5 feet of snow, but she's just fine.
5 inches.
I'm sorry. It shows my naivete about snow in the other areas. Sorry, I really blew that. So tonight she will tell you about her reintroduction work with Peregrine Falcons, Hawaiian Crows, and California Condors, which are also the subject of this just tremendous book, which she'll show you the cover of too, but called Feather Trails. A journey of discovery among endangered birds. It's very well received and very intriguing. I can speak to you about that because I read the book. She served as the field manager for the Peregrine Fund's California Condor Restoration Project in Arizona for 3.5 years. And from her work there, she also produced a beautiful award-winning book called Condors in Canyon County. And both of her books are really wonderful. And this is a great book with photos as well. So after years of working as a wildlife biologist, helping birds through her field and policy work, Sophie now harnesses the power of words to raise awareness about threats to birds and to inspire conservation actions for them as well. And her focus on writing now is bird natural history. The latest ABA book review online, if you subscribe to the American Birding Association, they just reviewed her book a few days ago, January 9th, singles out her book, Feather Trails, as, quote, an engaging and entertaining memoir that also serves as a call to action. It would be an excellent read for any birder interested in delving into the fascinating world of on-the-ground conservation efforts, unquote. So Sophie, take it away. Welcome.
Thank you so much to all of you. Good evening to everyone who's tuned in. A big thanks to all of you for tuning in to hear about conserving endangered birds tonight. Oh, I need to share my screen quickly. Hold on, sorry about that. Let me do that. Okay, can everyone see that?
You're not,
Okay.
there we
There
go.
we go.
Yes,
Are we all set?
perfect. Yep.
Okay. My new book, Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds, describes my journey into the amazing world of birds. The book is in part a personal story about becoming and being a wildlife biologist. It takes you behind the scenes and it shows you what it's like to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save 3 endangered species, the Peregrine Falcon, the Hawaiian Crow, and the California Condor. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperil these and other birds. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries into the coal mines because the birds were highly sensitive to toxic gases like carbon monoxide. If the birds keeled over, it meant that the air had become unsafe for miners. Today, our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mines that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. Because birds are so visible and vocal, it's relatively easy for us to monitor them and determine if their populations are doing well or declining. And when birds are disappearing, it behooves us to figure out why. Because if we can resolve a problem that's impacting birds, we often end up helping other organisms that are being harmed as well, including quite often us. The peregrine falcon is a top-level predator that feeds mainly on birds and is found on every continent except Antarctica. It occurs in a wide variety of open habitats, from the Arctic tundra to mountain and desert canyons, from coastal cliffs to some of our largest cities like Chicago and New York. Today, peregrines are typically found where there are suitable nest sites, which consist of high ledges on cliffs, buildings, and structures like bridges. As most of you probably know, the falcons don't breed in Florida, but they do pass through during migration. Today, peregrines are fairly widespread, but years ago, beginning in the 1950s, they began disappearing at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist named Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in England in 1962. He discovered abandoned peregrine territories and broken eggs in peregrine nests, and he realized that peregrines weren't successfully raising young. After hearing about the dramatic decline of peregrines in Britain, a US biologist named Joe Hickey, who'd been a student of Aldo Leopold's and who wrote the first ever guide to bird watching, which I'm sure is of interest to many of us, he launched a peregrine survey in the eastern US in 1964. During that summer, biologists checked every known peregrine territory east of the Mississippi River, from Alabama up to Nova Scotia, and they didn't find a single peregrine. The eastern peregrine had completely disappeared. A follow-up conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965 brought together scientists, falconers, and naturalists from around the world. Peregrine declines were reported from 36 countries on 5 continents, and biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. At the conference, several British scientists presented preliminary evidence that pesticides might be involved in peregrine declines. A new pesticide known as DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to combat agricultural and forest insect pests. The British scientists showed that peregrines had disappeared from areas where DDT and other toxic pesticides were being heavily used. And this was admittedly tenuous evidence, but it inspired many of the Madison Conference attendees to go on to study the effects of pesticides on peregrines. Other attendees, including Tom Cade, who worked at Cornell University and later founded the conservation organization known as the Peregrine Fund, were eager to see if they could breed peregrines in captivity. We take captive breeding for granted nowadays, but at the time, this hadn't been done before for peregrines or for any other endangered birds. If captive breeding worked, then these biologists hoped to reintroduce peregrines to the wild in places where pesticide use was less prevalent. These two approaches, research and policy work on DDT and captive breeding and reintroduction, ultimately became the 2 prongs of a massive conservation effort to save the peregrine falcon. Captive breeding was eventually successful, and peregrine reintroductions began in the eastern US in 1974. By the time I headed to Wyoming in 1991 for my first field work as a biologist, releasing captive bred peregrines to the wild, the falcon had been reintroduced successfully in the east, and reintroductions were ramping up in the west. I'd only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent in grizzly bear country near Cody, Wyoming, which is one of the gateways to Yellowstone National Park. We spent our first week of work monitoring and feeding 5 captive reared falcons that had been driven to our release site at the age of 5 weeks and placed into a large plywood box known as a hack box. We had 3 males and 2 females, and each bird wore a differently colored leg band so that we could identify them. Being a budding young scientist, I had wanted to be objective and name the birds after their color bands, so red, yellow, green, but my field partner overruled me and named them after Egyptian gods and mythological figures, so you'll know where the names came from when I read a passage in a moment. The hack box was anchored to a small set of cliffs about a 30-minute hike from our camp, and each day we fed the falcons dead quail, and we took notes on the birds' activities and growth. On release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. And in these types of reintroductions, the first 24 hours are critical and a lot can go wrong. For example, a peregrine in Washington state flew out of the box, got carried aloft on a rising column of air, and was never seen again. We also had to worry about predators like golden eagles and great horned owls, and even adult peregrines, which could target the inexperienced young falcons as they took their first flights. Our peregrines all left the hack box within a few hours, and luckily they stayed nearby initially. Unfortunately, though, during an afternoon thunderstorm, a side door to the hack box blew shut with a bang and flushed the birds. They scattered into a violent wind and disappeared. All but one eventually made it back to the vicinity of the hack box by that first night, but you'll have to read the book to find out if our missing peregrine returned. I have to leave you with at least one teaser. Each day we provided food for our birds and scared away potential predators with noisemakers. And we watched over the young falcons from dawn to dusk. And over time, we really began to see their personalities emerge, which made our observations really entertaining. The greatest joy of the whole summer was watching these young peregrines learn to fly. We documented their first hesitant flights and their wobbly landings. And we watched them as they mastered their wings and learned how to use the wind. So I'm just going to read a 2-page excerpt of Feather Trails to describe what it was like to watch these birds. This is the longest passage I'll read. It's 4 minutes long. So get yourselves comfortable and settle in. So, The birds also spent more time soaring on updrafts of air, joining other raptors and tracing effortless circular paths on these invisible sky elevators. Most entertaining for us, our peregrines began fine-tuning their flight skills and developing their nascent predatory tendencies with endless pursuits and mock battles. Just as playing kittens developed the agility and strength to catch fleet and elusive prey, so too did the falcons' tireless aerial games fine-tune their bodies to respond to the evasive flights of the shorebirds, songbirds, and waterfowl that evolved over the eons to dodge the speed-made predators that hunted them. Though the wild chases had a playful air, these flights, this practice, would determine whether our peregrines became successful hunters and survivors, or whether they went hungry and perished. Evenings and mornings were now filled with the falcon's screams and aerial exploits, as one bird streamed after another like a small fighter plane locked onto a fast-moving target. The pursued bird dodged and rolled, tucked its wings, and fell earthward in ever more sophisticated evasive maneuvers. Becoming one with the sky, the peregrines flew with ineffable grace, dazzling speed, and breathtaking agility. As I watched their transcendent flights, I felt my own heart quicken. Transported by the falcon's inimitable aerial prowess, I could almost feel the wind stream behind me, feel every subtle movement of wing or tail that determined my trajectory, my speed, my effortless engagement with the wind. All the while, earthbound, I dispassionately scribbled my field notes, recording our falcon's flights while never taking my eyes off the birds as they traced invisible loops across the firmament, imprinting their movements, their exuberance, their vitality forever in my mind's eye, and lifting my spirits in ways that only such epiphanic sights in nature can. Small wonder that legendary raptor expert Leslie Brown called the unmatched and unmatchable peregrine the prince of all flying birds. Now Ra launched from the cliff top and with strong wing beats chased after Isis, who had glided over him, trailing an invisible weight that seemed to pull the young male into motion. Climbing above her, he screamed a challenge, then drew in his wings and dropped toward her at a steep angle. Cacking in protest, Isis tucked a wing, fell away sideways, and rolled over, presenting her ferocious talons. Undaunted, Ra extended his legs and grabbed Isis's talons in his own. Briefly, the two cartwheeled through the sky, their screams echoing off the cliffs and ricocheting over the valley. Seconds later, they released each other, and Isis circled over the cliff before extending her wings, flaring her tail, and landing with an almost imperceptible wobble. And then another tiercel, that's a young male, materialized out of the clouds, and the pursuer became the pursued. Drawing his wings close to his body, Osiris dropped toward Ra with breathtaking speed and an agility that the larger-bodied, proportionately shorter-winged Isis could never match. Undaunted, Ra dropped to his side, cacking fiercely as Osiris shot harmlessly past him. Leveling out, Ra flapped his wings, found an updraft, and shot skyward. Circling briefly, he dived at Osiris, and the two sped like nanojets out of view behind the cliffs. Ever watchful and attuned to the world around him, Gawain tilted his head to the right and then left, keeping a close eye on Ra and Osiris's antics from the cliff top as Isis preened assiduously beside him. His large eyes seemed to take in the entirety of the heavens, and he watched his fellow tiercels long after I had lost them from view. Although the open skies were now a significant component of our falcon's world, our view of the birds was all too often blocked by cliffs, rocks, trees, and hills. But even when I could no longer see our falcons, the trails they had blazed across the sky still lingered in my mind, and the peregrine's surreal speed and arresting acrobatics, even at this young age, left me awed. Our summer had plenty of adventures, including one of our birds being attacked by a golden eagle. But about 5 weeks after their release, the falcons began to disperse as they learned to hunt for themselves. By 6 weeks post-release, we rarely saw them. After they reached independence, they spent a few more months fine-tuning their hunting skills before embarking on their first migration. About half of juvenile peregrines survive their first year. Radio tracking studies have shown that some falcons are killed by predators. Others die in collisions with cars, buildings, and power lines, and some die in storms or are lost at sea. I could only hope that my young peregrines were successful, since I never learned their fates. But my time working with them was a life-transforming experience that inspired me to dedicate my career to helping birds. Over time, reintroductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were wildly successful. Nearly 7,000 peregrines were reintroduced to the wild in the US and Canada, and the falcons began to recolonize their former nesting territories. But what really allowed the peregrine falcon to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. As a top predator, peregrines killed birds that had fed on invertebrates, vegetation, or seeds that were contaminated with DDT. And by consuming lots of these birds over time, peregrines accumulated DDE, which is a breakdown product of DDT, in their bodies. And this affected their calcium production, which made the birds lay thin-shelled eggs. Fish-eating birds like bald eagles, ospreys, and brown pelicans also accumulated DDE in their bodies. All of these birds inadvertently crushed their eggs while incubating them, so they couldn't successfully raise any young, which led to huge population declines. It took many years of dying birds, scientific studies, environmental advocacy, the first ever environmental lawsuits, and a couple of high-profile public hearings before DDT was finally banned. But rather than learn from the lessons that peregrines and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are less acutely toxic to vertebrates than, like birds, than DDT was, but they're far, far more toxic to insects. And their widespread use has contributed to what many have dubbed an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of our insects. Neonics are known as systemic insecticides, meaning that they're absorbed by a plant's roots and leaves, making the entire plant toxic. So insects that feed on any part of the plant, including its fruits and flowers, either die or are debilitated. Neonics are soluble in water, so they're transported by runoff from terrestrial to aquatic environments where they can contaminate our surface water and groundwater. These pesticides are widely used in agriculture. Seeds of more than 140 crops are coated with neonicotinoids before being planted. And although neonics are less toxic to vertebrates than some of the pesticides that preceded them, a single corn seed treated with imidacloprid, which is one of the oldest and most widely used of the neonics, can kill a bird the size of a blue jay. Consuming lesser amounts can disrupt a songbird's ability to reproduce, so they still are very harmful to birds. More than anything, though, it's the disappearance of insects on which so many birds feed that's the biggest cause for alarm. Over time, neonics have had a tremendous impacts on our ecosystems. Neonics are toxic to the earthworms and the organisms in our soils, to the aquatic invertebrates that feed our fish, to the bees and butterflies that pollinate our plants, and of course to the insects that sustain our birds and bats. So despite the dramatic lessons of the DDT era, we're once again overusing a class of persistent pesticides whose impacts are widespread but still poorly understood. The European Union banned the use of some neonicotinoids in 2018. Here in the US, though, we've been much slower to tackle this problem. There's still no federal regulations limiting the use of neonicotinoids, but a growing number of cities and a dozen or so states are starting to curtail or even ban their use. But to return to peregrines, the species is doing well for now, although I have to add an unfortunate caveat that there's recent concern that the falcon is being hard hit by the avian flu. That said, the fastest animal in the world was removed from the US endangered species list in 1999, and there are now about 3,000 pairs of peregrine falcons in North America. So this has been a real conservation success story. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as well for the second species I write about, the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's also known, and I'll use these names interchangeably. Most people are astonished to hear that any crow anywhere is critically endangered. Most of us know crows to be opportunistic and able to cope well with people and their habitat modifications. But crows that live on islands, and especially those that depend on forested habitats, are some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. Corvids are members of the crow, raven, jay, and nutcracker family. Despite its name, the Hawaiian crow is more closely related to the common raven than to the American crow. It occurs only on the island of Hawaii, which is also known as the Big Island, where it resides in the cloud forest. A good portion of the Alala's forested habitat was destroyed first by Polynesian and then by European colonizers and the animals that they brought with them. Hawaiian birds evolved on islands that had no mammals except for bats and no reptiles. So their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or the eo, as it's known in Hawaii. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with these kinds of predators. The rats can readily climb trees and consume eggs and nestlings. And Hawaiian crows that survived and left their nest successfully typically spent their first few weeks on the ground before they could fly. And that was a strategy that worked well in an environment with no predators. But in a world with cats and mongooses, the fledglings were acutely vulnerable to being killed. Outdoor cats are an additional threat because they carry and transmit diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that's dangerous to wildlife and to people. The parasite that causes this disease, Toxoplasma gondii, reproduces in feline intestines. It's excreted in cat feces in the form of oocysts, which are these single egg-like cells, and it's eventually ingested by an intermediate host, like a rat or a person. The parasite then settles in the host's brain, where it can affect the brain's neural circuitry. So infected rats end up losing their fear of cats, and they become easy prey, which restarts the parasite's ingenious life cycle. Toxoplasma oocysts that aren't ingested can remain in the environment for a really long time. Because of runoff, they can contaminate aquatic as well as terrestrial environments. Worldwide, toxoplasmosis is one of the most common human parasitic infections. People can become infected by eating contaminated vegetables or undercooked meat, by cleaning their cat's litter box if they have an outdoor cat, or even by weeding a garden that's visited by cats. Growing evidence suggests that the disease may be associated with a variety of mental disorders, including depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. And it's also harmed wildlife, killing several alala and at least 14 critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals. Hawaiian birds have also been decimated by mosquito-borne diseases. Mosquitoes were introduced to the islands in 1826, and they transmitted avian malaria and avian pox, which are two introduced diseases that were fatal to many of Hawaii's birds. These diseases are the major reason why Hawaii is now called the extinction capital of the world, sadly. Many of its native birds, especially some of its renowned honey creepers, a few of which I've pictured here, will die after contracting malaria from a single mosquito bite. Most of the native birds that are now left in Hawaii live at higher elevations where it's cooler and there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes can thrive at higher and higher elevations. And soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. As birds have shown us, introduced organisms, which have especially plagued islands, but have been a serious problem worldwide, threaten native wildlife, habitats, and humanity. They degrade biodiversity, cause extinctions, and globally cost us about $423 billion a year. When I worked on the Hawaiian Crow Recovery Project in the early 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. My job was to safeguard the first 5 captive-reared alala to be released to the wild. These juvenile crows had come from eggs that were laid in the wild, and then they were brought into captivity and raised there. The nestling crows were transported from the captive rearing facility to the release site and kept in a hat box for several weeks before being released into the attached aviary. And after about a month in the aviary, they were released to the wild. I arrived about a week later, and this was my first impression upon arriving at the release site. A minute later, we pulled off the road into a clearing that held an aviary so immense, so spectacular, that I simply stared at it, wondering at the work that went into enclosing full-size trees in a fortress that was as impenetrable to outsiders as it had been accommodating to its prior occupants. We stepped out of the vehicle onto the wet grass. And then, through the mist, came a strangely euphonic medley of throaty, echoing screams, intermixed with rumbled growls and haunting, evocative wails. I felt my neck prickle. The eerie, commanding sounds seemed to drift out of the floating fog, seemed to embody the lost voices of the trees, the ferns, the vines, released at last from their cellulose prisons. I was hearing the most prominent and unforgettable voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest, that of the ala-la, as the Hawaiians dubbed their singular crow. The bird's native name means cry like a child, but the crow's varied, penetrating, ventriloquistic vocalizations could only come from a child of an otherworldly forest, a creature of a more primal time and place. I stood transfixed, irrevocably moved by the strange but captivating sounds which washed over me like a turbulent wind that spoke of an uncertain future, yet felt full of promise. And I thought, 12. Aside from the young reintroduced Hawaiian crows that I was hearing and was about to meet for the first time, only 12 ala-la remained in the wild. 12 birds to fill these forests with their astonishingly distinctive vocal repertoires. 12 birds to embody the lost world that lingered in this enigmatic place. 12 birds to carry this unique and intriguing species into the future. For a moment, I felt the full weight and the privilege of the task on which I was about to embark. Along with a field partner, I was tasked with tracking the newly released crows through the cloud forest. They were outfitted with radio transmitters on their tails and monitoring their behavior. In addition, we provided supplemental food for them until they learned to feed on their own. The crows quickly learned to forage for themselves. Ala-la eat a wide variety of forest fruits, and they're really important seed dispersers. They also feed on insects, which they find under flakes of bark or in clusters of leaves, and they probe flower blossoms for nectar. The ala-la were remarkable. In addition to being very vocal, they were funny, playful, and incredibly engaging. They're also really intelligent. They're one of the few bird species that can use tools to secure difficult-to-reach food items. The crows often forage the way they're doing in this photo by hanging at the tips of tree branches, and they sometimes engaged in entertaining foot fights where they would grasp each other's feet and push and pull at each other until one of the birds fell off the perch they were on. So I'll just read a short section that describes an intriguing interaction between our two male crows, Kehau and Malama. They were brothers. 5 days into my work with the ala-la, I set out on a gray morning to follow Kehau and Malama, but I felt under the weather. To my surprise, it quickly became apparent that Malama felt that way too. As the other crows busily hopped along branches, poking their bills under bark and into ohia blossoms, Malama rested, perching quietly and preening sporadically. Fortunately, the other ala-la stayed nearby, moving from tree to tree as they foraged. Upon completing yet another behavioral scan, I noted with growing concern that I had recorded Malama sleeping several times, a highly unusual morning behavior. Kehau appeared to be as puzzled as I was by his erstwhile companion's actions. Sidling up to Malama, he made soft mewing calls, then gently preened his sibling's head and neck and delicately nibbled his face. When his ministrations failed to arouse the subdued bird, Kehau plucked an unopened koa flower bud, part of a berry-like cluster that would open into a creamy white powder puff blossom, and pushed it carefully into Malama's back feathers with his bill. No response. Kehau cocked his head, watching Malama, then stretched out his neck, plucked another globular koa bud, and again stashed it with cautious deliberation into Malama's plumage. Still no response. Kehau repeated the process again and again, and still Malama failed to react. Tilting his head, Kehau looked at Malama, murmuring quietly to him. Finally, Malama fluffed out his body feathers and shook them, a comfort behavior known as rousing that often follows a bout of preening, and dislodged the buds, but he remained on his perch, staring at the ground. Malama had in fact contracted avian malaria, but we were able to get him medical help and spent a week or so treating him for the disease. Perhaps my favorite thing about the alala was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different calls, and to me, they're truly the voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest. Today, despite years of effort and numerous reintroductions, the Big Island's forests are silent, and the crows only exist in captivity in their former range. Surprisingly, one of the biggest challenges to the bird's recovery was that Hawaiian hawks killed so many of the reintroduced birds. Although the two species had coexisted for eons, the balance between the alala and its native predator has been upended. To circumvent this problem, 5 alala were recently introduced to the island of Maui, where the EO doesn't occur. And this reintroduction to the wild outside the crow's historical range is one of the last best hopes for the species' recovery. In addition, an experimental biocontrol is being used to try to reduce mosquito numbers. So heartbreaking as the alala story is, there's still hope for this captivating bird. And I hope that people will read about it and come to care about this unique crow, since the bird's future depends entirely on us. The California Condor story is much better known, but we generally hear more about recovery efforts in California, and I focus more on condor reintroductions in Arizona. This is the 3rd species that I write about in Feather Trails. The California condor is a member of the New World vulture family, and it's the largest terrestrial land bird in North America with a wingspan of about 9.5 feet. You can really appreciate its size when you see it flying with a common raven, as it's doing here. During the Pleistocene era, more than 10,000 years ago, California condors ranged from British Columbia down to Mexico and as far east as Florida and New York State. Their range contracted with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, which included animals like Columbian mammoths and these crazy looking giant ground sloths, which I've pictured here. By the 1900s, condors were largely restricted to Southern California. This was their core range in Southern California until the 1980s. But scattered reports exist of condors occurring outside of this area until the 1920s. One of the areas where condors occurred was the Grand Canyon region. Condors were abundant in this area in the Pleistocene, and they also occurred in Arizona in historic times. For example, 2 condors were seen near the western edge of what's today's Grand Canyon National Park in 1881. And the last sighting of a condor in Arizona was in 1924 near Williams, Arizona, which is just south of the Grand Canyon. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s, and when biologists conducted the first full population count in 1982, they were shocked to discover that there were only 22 condors left in existence, 21 in the wild and 1 in captivity. The birds had been disappearing for decades, but biologists really weren't sure why. Habitat loss and persecution were likely suspects. Many people shot condors, and the birds were also killed indiscriminately when people put out poison carcasses to kill predators like wolves and coyotes and bears. But after biologists started tracking condors that they'd outfitted with radio transmitters on their wings, they discovered several condors that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting lead ammunition fragments that were found in the carcasses that the birds had fed on. When lead bullets are shot into an animal, they lose about 30% of their mass, and they fragment into tiny particles, which are then inadvertently consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. It wasn't until years after the first lead-poisoned condor was found in 1984 that biologists really began to appreciate the severity of this threat to condors. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. After 6 condors disappeared over one winter, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few birds that were left in the wild to keep them safe and to bolster a captive breeding program. The last wild California condor, known as AC9, was captured in 1987 and brought into captivity. This was at the time an incredibly controversial and heartbreaking event for many people, since it meant that for the first time in tens of thousands of years, no condors flew over North America, and there was no guarantee that they ever would again. Fortunately, though, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very successful. And the first reintroductions of captive reared condors began in California in 1992. This is a photo of the first 2 birds that were reintroduced. And then in Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the Condor Recovery Program as the field manager for the Arizona condor reintroduction in 2000. And in addition to releasing condors to the wild, my job, along with my field crew, was to monitor the birds and keep them safe. This is the flight pen where we held condors on top of the Vermilion Cliffs before their release. And this is a smaller release pen right on the rim of the Vermilion Cliffs. After releasing condors to the wild, we taught them to roost in places that were safe from predators like coyotes, and we taught them to stay away from people by harassing them if they perched in inappropriate places, like on a roof looking into a window. Working with condors was a delight. The birds are gregarious, they're intelligent, and they're very, very playful. So I'll just read 2 quick excerpts that might show you a different side of this enormous vulture than some of you might expect. In the meantime, though, when transmitter signals indicated that a large group of condors was clustered together, I invariably looked for a carcass or a source of entertainment. After locating 11 condors on the Badger Canyon beach, I quickly surveyed the scene and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw no people, no boats, and no tents. Binoculars glued to my eyes, I sat back to enjoy the show. 2 condors played tug-of-war with a branch that had washed ashore. Others walked up and down a drift log, jostling for prime positions. Several paddled in an eddy at the river's edge, then sent water flying skyward as they bathed. Suddenly, Condor 196 emerged from a mid-beach condor scrum, holding an irresistible prize aloft in her bill, a plastic 1-gallon jug. She took off at a run, the other condors in hot pursuit, but with a sudden smack, 196 rammed face first into a boulder. Momentarily stunned, she sat back on her legs, still holding the jug that had obscured her view. Regaining her balance, 196 scrambled to her feet and ran on as the other condors closed in. Minutes later, 1-year-old Condor 227 commandeered the jug and flung it skyward with his bill. When it landed unexpectedly on his back, 227 leaped in mock fright and turned on his attacker. Seeming captivated by this new twist on the game, 227 again flung the opaque monster skyward, whereupon it fell back down and again landed on his back. Unnoticed on my distant clifftop perch, I laughed out loud, as captivated by the condor's activities as the birds were by their frenzied play. And this next excerpt gives an insight into how intelligent condors are. The condor's notable but unsung intelligence was underscored for me one evening when biologist Chris Leitner returned to the field house and described Condor 127's solo play with an empty plastic bottle on the Badger Beach. Exhibiting World Cup dexterity, 127 repeatedly punted the bottle down the beach with her bill and chased after it. As she pursued it, the bottle moved closer and closer to the river's edge until the water suddenly caught it and whisked it downstream. In vain, 127 ran along the shoreline, eyes fixed on the bobbing bottle. Just when it seemed lost to her, the current swept the bottle into an eddy several feet from the riverbank. Without hesitation, 127 waded into the water and reached out to retrieve her toy, but it floated just out of reach. Looking around, 127 spotted a partially submerged boulder beyond the bottle. Extending her wings, she hopped out onto the boulder. Now, by stretching her neck, she could just reach the bottle. Nudging it with her beak, she gave it a push shoreward. As it floated toward the beach, she hopped into the water and gave it another nudge, and then another. As the bottle touched solid ground, 127 resumed her frenzied play, punting it down the beach. I know it's anthropomorphizing, Chris remarked, but 127 seemed crushed when she lost her bottle, and she seemed so excited when she was able to retrieve it and could play with it again. As entertained as I was by Chris's story, I was equally struck by 127's intelligence. No level of rote, trial-by-error learning had enabled 127 to retrieve her toy. Instead, she had engaged in multiple steps to enact an outcome that she had envisioned, figuring out how to reach the bottle, then pushing her prize shoreward and counterintuitively away from her, step by careful step, so she could gain control of it again. On a more somber note, the most critical aspect of my job was keeping the condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. And to be clear, this is not a hunting issue. Hunting can really help condors because it provides the birds with so many carcass remains. Instead, it's solely an ammunition issue. If it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. The black and white specks in these x-rays of a shot deer and coyote are lead fragments. And so you can see how birds that fed on carcasses like these could ingest small particles of lead, which were enough to poison them. If we suspected that condors had fed on a carcass containing lead ammunition, we recaptured them, tested their blood for lead, and then treated them for lead poisoning if necessary. The treatment is known as chelation therapy, and it involves injecting condors in their breast muscle twice a day for 5 days with a substance that binds the lead and removes it from the body. In some years, nearly all of the condors in Arizona have been exposed to lead, with most of those requiring chelation. One condor in California had lead poisoning 13 times, so it received at least 130 chelation injections. And it's a stressful process of handling them and injecting them, and stressful for the birds and the handlers. So it's just a really challenging thing to have to treat birds that often. And although many condors are saved through chelation, lead poisoning is the way that roughly 2/3 of the reintroduced condors have died. Other scavengers like eagles and ravens are also poisoned when they ingest lead ammunition in carcasses. In a long-term eagle study in 38 states, nearly half of bald and golden eagles had chronic lead poisoning. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game meat? Are they vulnerable too? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed packages of venison that had been donated to local food banks by hunters in 2007. 59% of the packages contain visible lead fragments in an x-ray. And this is a photo of some of those packages. The white flecks are little bits of lead. When other states x-rayed venison that had been donated to their food banks, they also found alarming lead levels. Despite these findings years ago, though, food bank donations of hunter-killed game meat are still unregulated. We worry about lead in our pipes and in our children's toys, and yet every year hunters are donating millions of pounds of game meat shot with lead to those in need, and they're eating this kind of lead-filled meat themselves and feeding it to their families. This lead consumption could be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. Scores of medical doctors and public health experts have highlighted the human health threat posed by lead ammunition and called for the use of safer type of ammunition for hunting. Non-lead bullets that don't fragment are now widely available. No level of lead is considered safe for people, and toxic lead effects are largely irreversible. But despite that, hunter advocacy groups like the NRA say there's no cause for concern. We've been hunting with lead bullets for years and no one's ever been harmed by them. But the effects of lead can be subtle and they're often attributed to other causes. For example, in adults, chronic lead effects include high blood pressure, decreased kidney function, and reproductive issues such as impotence, infertility, and miscarriages. Lead exposure can cause digestive problems and muscle and joint pain. It may be related to cognitive decline and dementia in older adults, and it affects longevity. In children, lead can lower IQ levels and lead to learning disabilities and a higher frequency of delinquent and aggressive behavior. Lead exposure has also been linked to criminality. A number of studies attribute the widespread decline of violent crime in the 1990s to the phasing out of leaded gasoline in the late 70s and early 80s. But we still have no idea if ingesting lead ammunition is contributing to the violent crime and extremism that we're seeing in the US today. And I think that this bears investigation. We're very good at ignoring warning signs that things in our environment are dangerous to us. We've known that lead bullets are poisoning condors since the 1980s, and it's hard to imagine ignoring a bigger canary in the coal mine, but that's what we've been doing. Things are starting to change, fortunately. For the sake of condors, California banned the use of lead ammunition in 2019, which is a great start, but no other state has done that. And it's remarkable how rarely we hear about the human health impacts of lead ammunition. Despite the perils of lead, though, there were many highlights during my work with condors, which I write about extensively in this book. In 2001, I was fortunate to document the first egg laid in the wild by reintroduced condors. News of Condor 119's famous egg was broadcast all over the country, and even the world, actually, and Discover magazine included this event in their list of the top 100 science stories of 2001. I also had the good fortune of monitoring Arizona's very first condor chick. Condor 305 had the chance to be the first nestling raised by reintroduced condors to fledge in the wild. And I won't spoil the book by letting you know if this historic fledging happened, but I will say that it was an incredible roller coaster to get to this point in Arizona, and events in California were even more challenging. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, though, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered condor population numbers since its low point of 22 birds. Condors are now reproducing successfully in the wild, and they're reclaiming more and more of their former range. Thanks to the Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated people, these three magnificent species are still with us today. The peregrine falcon is one of our biggest conservation success stories. It taught us that the best way to recover species is to eliminate its main threat, in this case, the pesticide DDT. Not eliminating the main threat to a species undermines its recovery, as we've seen with the California condor, which still requires intensive management. But if we can replace lead ammunition with non-lead substitutes, then we'll be able to save the condor too. The Hawaiian crow faces multiple complex threats, which inevitably makes its recovery more challenging. And in addition, funding and recovery efforts were inadequate for many decades until it was almost too late. Hawaiian birds, which are some of our most endangered birds, are still underfunded compared to mainland species. But overall, the peregrine and other recovered birds have shown us that targeted conservation efforts really do work. We've had tremendous success recovering endangered species, but along the way, we've also come to appreciate that our best conservation strategy is to keep common birds common and prevent birds from becoming endangered in the first place. And that's where I think bird lovers like us can come in. At last count, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that 96 million people, 96 million of us watch and enjoy birds. And if we all do a few small things to help them, we might be able to turn around declining bird numbers. For example, we can keep our cats indoors. That's probably the best thing we can do to help birds, and it helps keep us safe from toxoplasmosis too. We can put decals on our windows to prevent bird collisions, avoid using pesticides, grow native plants and foster habitat around our homes, use non-lead ammunition if we hunt, and support our public lands and bird conservation organizations, just to name a few examples. There are countless other ways that we can help our local birds, and I try to provide additional suggestions whenever I write about birds. So those miners who used canaries in the coal mines to alert them to bad air, well, many of them became attached to the vibrant bits of color and life down in the mines, and they didn't want the birds to die. So when the canaries struggled for air, the miners revived their feathered companions with an oxygen tank. Conservationist Thomas Lovejoy said, quote, "If you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. By helping birds, we not only enrich our own lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we're also likely to solve a variety of environmental problems, and in the process, help a lot of other creatures that live on our planet too, including us." So thank you to all of you for listening to that whirlwind talk, and thank you for everything that you're doing to help birds. My book, Feather Trails, is available online and in bookstores and libraries, and it's currently available in hardback, Kindle, and audiobook versions. And just as a side note, reviewers for the American Birding Association, the ABA, chose Feather Trails as their favorite bird book of 2024. So please consider reading it. I'm eager to get my conservation messages out there into the world. And if you haven't read it or don't want to, maybe give a copy to your bird-loving friends and family members. And finally, you can also find more of my writing on the Substack platform or on my website. I write a blog called Words for Birds. So I'm happy to take any questions. I threw a lot of information at you all at once.
So questions. Well, while people are thinking of questions, Sophie, I was impressed and upset by your description of being a woman doing research as a wildlife biologist. And I want to be clear when I ask you this question in front of everyone that you were not beating a drum for shame on men for not being kinder to women wildlife biologists, but I was very struck by how hard it was for Sophie, who was very tactful in how she talked about prejudice as a woman. You said hired to handle enormous birds and oversee sometimes grueling field work. And she's very diplomatic and not attacking anyone specifically, including the men that were her bosses. But it's upsetting that still today, women are not treated equally as men as wildlife biologists. And gosh knows, we need all the wildlife biologists we can get, right? Do you have any comments while people get their questions together?
You know, it was a really hard issue, and I barely touched on it in this book, but I did put it in there, and I felt that was important. I only covered a tiny little portion of the discrimination and the pay inequities and the condescension and the frustration of sometimes it was my higher ups and supervisors that made things really difficult, and sometimes it was men on the field crew, and it could be really hard. I felt like every time I started a new job, I had to prove myself all over again. No one ever took for granted my work, no matter how many years I had worked, no matter what I had done. A guy in my position, people just assume, you know, they took whatever he said to do and took his his abilities for granted, but I had to start from scratch every time to prove myself. So it was really frustrating, but I wanted this book to be really about the birds and not about me and what I experienced. On the other hand, I did want to at least mention that I had had a little bit of a rough time in some respects, because I wanted women out there today to know that, you know, this happens, it's out there, many of us experience this, and also let men know some of them may not have been aware that they were behaving the way they were. And so I just wanted people to know that this was a thing out there. It still is a thing out there. It can be really challenging. But again, you know, the focus is 99.9% on the birds, but I also wanted to know that being a biologist is tough, man or woman, but it's especially has some unique challenges when you're a woman out in the field.
Right. Thank you for that. Catherine Prophet says, thank you so much. While I knew much of these stories, I'm also a biologist who works with birds. It was great to hear the personal details and updates on their current situations.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that you enjoy that. And there's, you know, I barely skimmed the surface. There's so much more in this book. So hopefully you'll get lots more of that if you end up reading it.
It's a great read. It's very, very interesting to do.
I definitely hit a lot on some of the threats to bird and the issues, the conservation issues that are concerned to me, but some people have said it reads like a novel. I mean, it is a story about these birds and what their lives are like and what it was like being with them in the field. So there's a lot of stories about just what it's like to be out there in the wild working with these birds.
Jenny Cherry says, what an absolute incredible and blessed journey you have and are on. My heart broke when I read as a child, what chemicals did to the bald eagles. I had no idea this included peregrine falcons, but hearing your story makes my heart rejoice. She shows a pair of binoculars. Thank you for your persistent hard work. I love every bird you mentioned tonight, even the condor. This is a God-honoring job to rescue his creation. We are without excuse. We're also thankful for the insight of the lead poisoning and parasites.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate that. And I really felt, you know, blessed to be working with these species, and they made all the hard days and all of the terrible conditions being out there in the rain and the snow, and you'll hear about me getting stuck in trucks in Arizona in deep snow and all kinds of inclement conditions, but the birds really made it worthwhile. They are incredible species, and I was just one of, you know, many thousands of people who have worked to bring these species back. But it is encouraging that I think it's a very hopeful story that our efforts can make a difference to birds. So often we feel like we're doing things in vain, but these species, you know, we've really managed to turn their numbers around. So it is very hopeful. And hopefully it inspires people to keep at it and keep doing what we can to help birds.
Well, thanks to your persistence and people like you. What organizations supported your work? Somebody asks.
I worked for a variety of different organizations, sometimes federal organizations, sometimes nonprofits, but there are a lot of nonprofit organizations that are working on many of these endangered species projects. It's often a collaborative of a whole variety of different groups that are working on them. For example, with condors, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plays a huge role in Southern California, but then a nonprofit group, the Ventana Wildlife Society, does the reintroductions in Central California. The Peregrine Fund does which is also a nonprofit, does reintroductions in Arizona. So you have a bunch of different groups, and I think it was just sort of coincidental because in my career, I've worked with a lot of different types of organizations and entities, but most of the jobs that I describe in Feather Trails were with the Peregrine Fund, which does some wonderful work helping raptors, especially around the world.
Can you comment on the live cams? I guess they're mostly in California, right? People who want to know more about condors, the live cams are really amazing.
They really are. And I actually write about the webcams in my last Condor chapter. And I think that the webcams are amazing because I think they give people an opportunity to experience what my life was like as a biologist and the best parts of being a wild biologist. I mean, you don't have to have the inclement weather. You can sit at your desk and get to watch birds raising their young or, bringing food into their nestlings. And I just think the webcams are amazing.
Where are they?
There's one, so for condors, there's one in Central California. If you get on the Ventana Wildlife Society's website, they have a condor cam on, I think at their release site on carcasses. Whenever birds nest in a big cavity in a redwood, they have a camera in there, so you can actually watch the condors raising young. But the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a bunch of webcams. You can watch albatrosses raising young in New Zealand. If you Google webcams, you can watch tropical birds in Panama coming to a feeding station. I just think it's a wonderful way to get your wildlife fix and experience what it's like to be out there watching birds engaging in cool behavior in the wild.
So Karen's put a link up to the Ventana, California camp.
Perfect.
Yeah. And can you speak, someone's asking, do you have any sense about whether the current fires affect the condors or their location?
Right now, I think they have been to the south of the condors in Southern California, which are in Ventura. But when I'm hearing about the coming winds in the next week, they could be hitting the condor area. So I'm sure that the field crews and the Fish and Wildlife Service are doing everything they can to help address that problem. A couple of years ago, Central California had some terrible fires that destroyed their release site, that killed several condors. So these events can be really perilous for the birds and the recovery efforts, which is in part why when we try to work to recover species like this, that we try to do it in different locations. That was the very reason that condors were introduced to Arizona as well as California, so that if some natural disaster hit the California flock or a disease like avian flu, which hit the Arizona flock a few years ago, that you don't have all your eggs in one basket and you don't lose all the birds. So the birds are in Southern California. They are right on the edge of the current fires, and they could get affected. Hopefully right now, the Southern California populations, the Northern California and Central California populations is safe. Mexico's population is safe, and Arizona's condor population is safe, hopefully. So let's just all hope that the fires don't hit the condor release area.
Or anybody else.
Or anybody else, all the people. I know it's been a terrible, terrible, tragic.
May they burn back on themselves and go out to sea and leave every living creature alone.
No kidding.
I want to thank you so much for your talk tonight. This is fascinating. I encourage everybody to get a hold of her book, read it, The Feather Trails, and also the condors in Canyon County. It's a country. And Canyon Country is really also a fascinating book with a lot of descriptions and photos. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been amazing to talk to such a incredible Audubon group. I'm really lucky and grateful.
So are we. So next month on February 10th, Jamie Rotenberg, who lives here in Sarasota now, was a professor of ecology at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. And in doing his ecology research in Belize, he happened upon harpy eagles, or actually at least one harpy eagle which was astonishing. It was the furthest north that anyone had discovered, or any ornithologist or professional bird ornithologist kind of professor had found harpy eagles. So he's going to talk about harpy eagles in Belize. So please be sure and join us on February 10th. And also that day, be sure and attend so you learn the latest to be available 2 days later to go be part of our support for celery fields, and wishing the Smith Farm, the commissioners turned down the Smith Farm proposal.
Yes, thank you, Margie.
Thank
Okay.
you, Sarah.
Good luck.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Sophie.
Thank you all. Good night.
See you
Good
all
night.
next
Thanks,
month.
Sophie.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.